on strategy in general. Military virtues of the army. Military virtues should not be confused with simple bravery, and still less with enthusiasm for the cause. Bravery is obviously a necessary component, but just as bravery, which is part of the natural makeup of a man's character, can be developed in a soldier, a member of an organisation, it must develop differently in him than in other men. In the soldier, the natural tendency for unbridled action and outbursts of violence must be subordinated to demands of a higher kind: obedience, order, rule, and method. An army's efficiency gains life and spirit from enthusiasm for the cause for which it fights, but such enthusiasm is not indispensable. War is a special activity, different and separate from any other pursued by man. This would still be true no matter how wide its scope, and though every able-bodied man in the nation were under arms. This would still be true no matter how wide its scope, and though every able-bodied man in the nation were under arms. Doesn't make any sense anyway. An army's military qualities are based on the individual who is steeped in the spirit and essence of this activity, who trains the capacities it demands, rouses them and makes them his own, who applies his intelligence to every detail, who gains ease and confidence through practice, and who completely immerses his personality in the appointed task. No matter how clearly we see the citizen and the soldier in the same man, how strongly we conceive of war as the business of the entire nation, opposed diametrically to the pattern set by the condottieri of former times, the business of war will always remain individual and distinct. Consequently, for as long as they practice this activity, soldiers will think of themselves as members of a kind of guild in whose regulations, laws and customs the spirit of war is given pride of place. And that does not seem to be the case. No matter how much one may be inclined to take the most sophisticated view of war, it would be a serious mistake to underrate professional pride, esprit de corps, as something that may and must be present in an army to a greater or lesser degree. Professional pride is the bond between the various natural forces that activate the military virtues. In the context of this professional pride, they crystallize more readily. An army that maintains its cohesion under the most murderous fire, that cannot be shaken by imaginary fears and resists well-founded ones with all its might, that proud of its victories, will not lose the strength to obey orders and its respect and trust for its officers even in defeat, whose physical power, like the muscles of an athlete, has been steeled by training in privation and effort, a force that regards such efforts as a means to victory rather than a curse on its cause, that is mindful of all these duties and qualities by virtue of the single powerful idea of the honour of its arms. Such an army is imbued with the true military spirit. It is possible to fight superbly, like the men of the Vendée, and to achieve great results, like the Swiss, the Americans, and the Spaniards, without developing the kind of virtues discussed here. It is even possible to be the victorious commander of a regular army, like Prince Eugene and Marlborough, without drawing substantially on their help. No one can maintain that it is impossible to fight a successful war without these qualities. We stress this to clarify the concept and not lose sight of the idea in a fog of generalities that give the impression that military spirit is all that counts in the end. That is not the case. The spirit of an army may be envisaged as a definite morale factor that can be mentally subtracted, whose influence may therefore be estimated. In other words, it is a tool whose power is measurable. Having thus characterized it, we shall attempt to describe its influence and the various ways of developing it. Military spirit always stands in the same relation to the parts of an army as does a general's ability to the whole. The general can command only the overall situation and not the separate parts. At the point where the separate parts need guidance, the military spirit must take command. Generals are chosen for their outstanding qualities, and other high-ranking officers are carefully tested. But the testing process becomes less thorough the further we descend on the scale of command, and we must be prepared for a proportionate diminution of personal talent. What is missing here must be made up by military virtues. The same role is played by the natural qualities of a people mobilized for war: bravery, adaptability, stamina, and enthusiasm. These, then, are the qualities that can act as substitutes for the military spirit and vice versa, leading us to the following conclusions. 1. Military virtues are found only in regular armies, and they are the ones that need them the most. In national uprising and people's wars, their place is taken by natural warlike qualities, which develop faster under such conditions. 2. A regular army fighting another regular army can get along without military virtues more easily than when it is opposed by a people in arms. For in the latter case, the forces have to be split up, and the separate units will more frequently have to fend for themselves, where the troops can remain concentrated. However, the talents of the commander are given greater scope and can make up for any lack of spirit among the troops. Generally speaking, the need for military virtues becomes greater the more the theatre of operations and other factors tend to complicate the war and disperse the forces. So, if there is a lesson to be drawn from these facts, it is that when an army lacks military virtues, every effort should be made to keep operations as simple as possible, or else twice as much attention should be paid to other aspects of the military system. The mere fact that soldiers belong to a regular army does not automatically mean they are equal to their tasks. Military spirit, then, is one of the most important morale elements in war. Where this element is absent, it must either be replaced by one of the other elements, such as the commander's superior ability or popular enthusiasm, or else the results will fall short of the efforts expended. How much has been accomplished by this spirit, this sterling quality, this refinement of base ore into precious metal, is demonstrated by the Macedonians under Alexander, the Roman legions under Caesar, the Spanish infantry under Alexander Farnese, the Swedes under Gustavus Adolphus and Charles XII, the Prussians under Frederick the Great, and the French under Bonaparte. One would have to be blind to all the evidence of history if one refused to admit that the outstanding successes of these commanders and their greatness in adversity were feasible only with the aid of an army possessing these virtues. There are only two sources for this spirit. They must interact in order to create it. And there are only two sources for this spirit, and they must interact in order to create it. The first is a series of victorious wars. The second, frequent exertions of the army to the utmost limits of its strength. Nothing else will show a soldier the full extent of his capabilities. The more a general is accustomed to place heavy demands on his soldiers, the more he can depend on their response. A soldier is just as proud of the hardships he has overcome as of the dangers he has faced. In short, the seed will grow only in the soil of constant activity and exertion, warmed by the sun of victory. Once it has grown into a strong tree, it will survive the wildest storms of misfortune and defeat, and even the indolent inertia of peace, at least for a while. Thus, the spirit can be created only in war and by great generals, though admittedly it may endure for several generations at least, even under generals of average ability and through long periods of peace. One should be careful not to compare this expanded and refined solidarity of a brotherhood of tempered, battle-scarred veterans with the self-esteem and vanity of regular armies, which are patched together only by service regulations and drill. Grim severity and iron discipline may be able to preserve the military virtues of a unit, but it cannot create them. These factors are valuable, but they should not be overrated. Discipline, skill, and goodwill, a certain pride, and high morale are other attributes of an army trained in times of peace. They command respect, but they have no strength of their own. They stand or fall together. One crack and the whole thing goes, like a glass too quickly cooled. Even the highest morale in the world can, at the first upset, change all too easily into despondency and almost boastful fear. The French would call it sauve qui peut. An army like this will be able to prevail only by virtue of its commander, never on its own. It must be led with more than normal caution until, after a series of victories and exertions, its inner strength will grow to fill its external panoply. We should take care never to confuse the real spirit of an army with its mood. There you go. That was quite a long chapter. Not excessively long. And to be quite honest, I didn't really get any of that. There are a few bits there that sort of made sense. You know, after sort of reading through them, I mean, talking about military spirit and then relating it to the Roman legions under Caesar. You know, the Swedes under Gustavus Adolphus, the Prussians under Frederick the Great, the French under Bonaparte. And it's not really clear from the beginning, but I think it's basically saying that this is a sort of the military virtues are, well, it's basically saying towards the end that they are forced, that they are created by victories, and it says here there should be two sources for this. The first is a series of victories of victorious wars, and the second, frequent exertions of the army to its utmost limits of its strength. So, and it's talking about the exertion. So, these are things that sort of that add a little more dimension and sort of substance to the sort of the narrative in overall, but it still doesn't make any sense to me, a lot of sense. So if you start from the beginning, the military virtue should not be confused with simple bravery, and still less with enthusiasm for cause. Bravery is obviously a necessary component, but just as bravery, which is part of the natural makeup of a man's character, can be developed in a soldier, a member of an organisation, it must develop differently in him than in other men. In the soldier, the natural tendency for unbridled action and outbursts of violence must be subordinated to demands of a higher kind, obedience, order, rule, and method. And an army's efficiency gains life and spirit from enthusiasm for the cause for which it fights, and such enthusiasm is not indispensable. You know, it doesn't really mention anything about, you know, the things that it picks up on later, in particular about having victories, but I think basically what it's talking about is what we would say here is military virtues. I mean, it doesn't really make any sense. It seems to me as though it's saying sort of, I mean, I've played other games where it's not so much what we call virtue. I'm trying to think of the words that they use. It's a game called Europa Universalis, when you have these units and they gain prestige over time. So when you win battles, you get prestige, and and it's slightly different to becoming an elite unit. You know, prestige is slightly different, and I think it sort of consolidates that sort of thinking a little bit when it talks about the armies. For example, the French under Bonaparte, you know, they were sort of marching around, in particular their old guard, gaining prestige through continued victories. You know, I mean, Napoleon wasn't known for losing wars and battles and campaigns, and I think it's sort of touching on that, and to the extent that it can be rolled over through the generations even. And I think, what you've got to look at to some extent is how that is reflected in modern wars. And I haven't even moved my mouse yet. The mouse has gone to sleep. I'm just changing the screen here. But basically, I think if you look at how it relates to modern wars, you sort of think, well, okay, what about the British? Have they got a virtuous army? And to some extent they have, and this does actually sort of bring home to me to a small extent, because there's this massive undercurrent of virtue. I'll use the word virtue because it's what we're talking about here, but prestige stemming from the Second World War, basically. And it's almost as though we fought the wars, we won the battles, we did all the things that it's saying about military virtues here. We won the wars, we won the battles, and the army was pushed to its utmost limits of its strength. And not only was the army pushed, but the people were pushed. And I think that prestige or that virtue has held strong. And I've quite often said, so I'm not anti-English or anti-British in any way, but I just keep coming to the conclusion that we just don't have that anymore. And I think one of the big things that I always sort of like demonstrate that through was the kudos that the army had in the Second World War was to a large extent based on the fact that it was the people of the country, people, clockmakers, bricklayers, factory workers, bus drivers, jewelers, landowners, all these, well, maybe not landowners, they seem to always get clear of it, don't they? But people were just being called up to fight, whereas what we have these days is nothing of the sort. People are signing up because they want to be paid. And it's a big difference, they want to be paid and they want a pension and they want a house. And it makes a very different sort of person because they're just doing it for a job. And there's nothing wrong with that. But to some extent, I've known people that joined the police. You think, well, okay, you joined the police, fantastic, very noble. What else could you have done? Oh, I see, you could have you failed at something else, and so you then joined the police. Joining the army is the sort of thing that people do because they can't think of anything else to do, and then they realise that they're actually earning money. And I don't want to sort of drag too much into that, but it's not the same thing as we had in the Second World War, where people were signing up because everyone else on the street had signed up, and they were going along, and everyone was fighting together. And so you basically just got this sort of paid army that is still hanging on to the the apron strings of the military virtue earned in the Second World War. We had, and it's saying here, it's got to be sort of tested, and I think to some extent that's one of the reasons why the nations that are going to war regularly because they need to be constantly demonstrating and gaining victories and pushing their forces to the utmost of its limits, etc., etc. And basically just, maintaining these virtues and maintaining, the experience that's required. If the United States had not been to war since 1946 in any capacity whatsoever, it probably would be a very different country with very different sort of expectations of its military. But even looking, say, at the Swiss, we don't really expect them to be a fairly effective fighting force, but they could be. And a lot of these smaller countries, smaller European countries, they're they probably fall into the same sort of category of relatively untested through the years. You have countries like France that have play an active role in North Africa and African continent. With their Foreign Legion, other European countries, I mean Germany pretty much not, because of the things that it signed after the Second World War. But Russia is obviously doing a lot. I mean, but China hasn't done anything, and so when you start to sort of look at all of this stuff, it's sort of, well, I don't know. I'm not sure really what I'm saying, to be quite honest. I'm just trying to sort of get a handle on all of this. But it seems to be that in order to keep the military virtue that it's talking about in this particular example high, you need to be constantly going to war and constantly testing the mettle of your troops in one form or another. And I don't know. I mean, I'm just trying to apply that sort of. Well, if you look at Syria, Iraq at the moment, I mean, their armies. Do they have that sort of mettle these days? I mean, the Iraqi army, quite interestingly enough, could be forced into the same situation that they were in 2014 when Mosul was being attacked by ISIS, and here is Samarra being attacked by ISIS, and basically they ran away. But would the Iraqi army have the sort of the ability to actually do that? I mean, it talks here quite interestingly about how an army could have, where is it, fantastic morale. Even the highest morale in the world can at the first upset change all too easily into despondency and almost boastful fear. The French would call it sauve qui peut, if that French is correct. So I mean, and how much of that is true of modern armies? You can have morale and high morale, and that would be quite easily maintained and developed and nurtured in a training barracks in your home country. But as soon as you get somewhere else where you've actually got to then suddenly engage in life and death operations, as I said, how quickly would that fall to a despondency? And what this is saying is that the military virtue is sort of a separate thing to that would, I mean, if you were fighting for a force that had never been beaten, you would much less likely to fall into the despondency. And what it does actually mention here as well, that I didn't quite sort of pick up on right at first. One of the reasons I just read it through all the way from the start is I wanted to get through it because it's 3 pages, so I've covered it. I didn't want to start sort of doing one paragraph and then talking about it and then doing another and then find run out of time or something. But it starts talking about how it's actually related directly to morale. It doesn't start off with saying military virtue is highly related and tied to morale. It doesn't say that. But when you start to get through to the other end of it, it actually basically almost infers that it's a morale factor. There are only 2 sources for this spirit, and they must interact in order to create it first. Okay. The soldier is just as proud of the hardships he has overcome as the dangers he has faced. In short, the seed will grow only in the... I like this bit. In short, the seed will grow only in the soil of constant activity and exertion, warmed by the sun of victory. Once it has grown into a strong tree, it will survive the wildest storms of misfortune and defeat, and even the indolent inertia of peace, at least for a while. I don't know why he called indolent. I mean, the only thing he could have topped that with is the insolent inertia of peace. The brutality of peace, as peace brutally quashes the virtues of war. Trying to find that bit on morale. I think it's very wishy-washy, and I've gone through this, and I like the way it makes me think. And I think what it's talking about here is something greater than Warblog could really convey, above and beyond what I've already stated. for example, the applying things like that into the counter. So instead of having a virtue stat, it's just, you have it a greater strength or a greater defence. I think, looking at this, and it's always, you have to be a bit careful which way you just sort of generally talk about it. I mean, you can't talk about these things freely on the internet, can you, really? But, the ISIS have, developed for themselves, a degree of this military virtue. I think from what I don't believe everything I read, but I think I get the impression that they are feared. The very name Daesh, and they're feared, and they've had lots of people expect, I think, superhuman efforts from them. So they're all they are demons, and they're always going to be exactly where you don't want them to be, and they're not going to get hit by bullets, but you are, and that sort of thing. And I think that they have possibly what this article is referring to. That sort of virtue that will help them in battle, whereas the Iraqi army and the Syrian army, especially the Iraqi army, they lost virtually all of that by running away and essentially being a country in rout. They were beaten by the Americans twice, the Allies, and it doesn't really matter, how resentful or how you feel about that. It's a matter of fact, and and I think that to some extent, I said that in the previous video on war in general, whatever this video series is called, on strategy in general. I think I said that about they've actually failed to galvanise a national army, the Iraqis, the Syrians to a lesser extent, but they've got the PMF here, Popular Mobilisation Forces, PMU, Popular Mobilisation Units, which are basically sponsored Iranians to a large extent. It depends on how you look at it. But they're not Iraqi army units, because people are not flocking to the Iraqi army to join up because of the virtue of the army. They lost major wars, and then they collapsed into almost anarchy. I don't think there was any sort of patriotic sense, as especially in Syria, as every single sort of organised military entity basically organised for itself, as opposed to the state. And also the Americans would like to say that was a revolution, whereas probably more realistically it was just probably, I don't want to say greed, but it was just something else. I think that they were just there's a driving force, that almost a feudalism in it, and I think that that's common across a lot of these things, especially in places like Africa. And you get these movements and these forces, but they're more feudalistic in the sense that they're local warlords, and they've grown accustomed to power, and really, being a subordinate administrative element in a national enterprise isn't really their cup of tea. They want to be, lords and masters, even if it's for a short period of time. And I think that's sort of, to some extent, what has happened in the Middle East. They've lost that military virtue and the ability to form a nation, and it's one of the things that the Western nations, I think, are sort of, again, I think this is, I don't particularly agree with a lot of what this narrative says, and I'm not even sure that it's just because it's dated. I just think he's talking crap, really. I don't want to say it quite like that, but but at the same time, I think it has an important lesson or important parallel with what's happening today. And I quite often say this, there's the whole idea of having an army. It's got nothing else to do with anything other than support of the nation, in sort of most direct sense, really. And if you start to denationalise people that you could maybe describe as nationalists, people that do not want to fight for your country, you then lose the actual substance and the sort of, you know, the life force that's required to create an army to fight for your country. I just don't know what examples to use, really, because you choose one and the other and you sort of think, oh, I'm just picking on someone. But I think in general, you know, that's the case. And so we're talking about here, you know, the virtues, and you know, and reading through. Let me just pick up another paragraph and just try and sort of get directly back onto the plot, so to speak. It is possible to fight superbly, like the men of the Avendi, and to achieve great results, like the Swiss, the Americans, and the Spaniards, without developing the kind of virtues discussed here. So, to be honest, I think what he's talking about there is, you know, he hasn't really sort of spilled the beans yet in his opening paragraph as to what he's really talking about. But what he's saying there, fighting superbly, well, you have to have all the victories, but, and I think this is actually quite an interesting point, you have to have you have to have been pushed to the limits. And I think that was something that I was actually thinking of just the other day, and I can't remember whether I missed it out when I was talking about the section on the principal morale elements. But, you know, so it's saying here you can fight superbly, and I think that this is something that I touched on. I had a really great idea, and I forgot what it is now. But when the Americans basically fought against the Iraqis, for example, you know, you could say that they fought superbly. But what you can't necessarily say, according to this, is that they did not fight to the utmost limits of their strength. You know, they weren't forced to the full extent of their capacities. Now, the military machine might have been. It might have been a great, fantastic exercise in getting a ton of stuff, you know, halfway around the world and to organise it. But, you know, it wasn't something like D-Day where they really were, you know, where they actually suffered. I mean, you know, I think a lot of these tankers, they probably feel as though they really weren't pushed to their limits because they were just sitting in a tank firing high ordnance, you know, munitions into relatively poorly defended locations. You know, if there was any resistance, you know, you just call in an airstrike or an artillery strike. I mean, you know, this sort of stuff started to happen in Vietnam, where they stopped carrying heavy weapons into battle because they could just call in airstrikes. You know, and I think that you get a sense of, you know, what he's trying to say there. If you look at it in that way, you know, these units can fight superbly. Without kind of, you know, it says it's even possible to become victorious of a regular army like Prince Eugene and Marlborough without drawing substantially on their help. No one can maintain that it is impossible to fight a successful war without these qualities. We stress this to clarify the concept that, and not lose sight of the idea in a fog of generalities and give the impression that military spirit is all that counts in the end. This is not the case. The spirit of an army may be envisaged as a definite moral factor, that's what it says, a definite morale factor that can be mentally subtracted, whose influence may therefore be estimated. In other words, it is a tool whose power is measurable. And it's interesting you say that, because you could then almost say, okay, we're in a war game, we're going to give them, you know, a virtue, and we're going to give ISIS a +1 on everything they do because they have, you know, pushed to their extremes and achieved those victories over time. So much so that they're still a formidable force, even though they don't have anything left anymore. And you sort of say, well, how long would that last? I don't think it's as great as, say, the virtue of some of these armies that it mentions here, like Bonaparte, because they didn't continue it through. I mean, it's interesting because I'm not sure whether I've really got it entirely, you know, down, but I think Hannibal might be. I think it's Hannibal. Who I'm thinking of the Roman slave Spartacus. I think it's Spartacus who freed himself and rode around on elephants in Rome for like 20 years or something. It seems incredible. But I think he would say that he had the virtue, and his army, you know, they had that. But the difference there is that they were that they did it over years and years. I mean, you know, the Iraqi civil war was started in like 2013, 2014, and you know, 4 years later they're completely defeated, and so they don't have that longevity of that sort of virtue. But the thing is, to some extent, they still did a lot, and I think they're leaning to some extent on the virtue that any terrorist organisation would actually carry by virtue of what they are, and that's one of the things about those sorts of organisations. You know, even the people like Boko Haram and the Taliban and Al Qaeda. You know, they all sort of bring a sense of fear, and it's a degree of virtue, I think, but it's probably it's probably the bastard child of virtue. But I think it's a similar sort of thing. You know, but we're talking about, I think what I'm getting on to there and angling at is the implication of the asynchronous nature of war. Whereas this guy, I can never remember who he's talking to, Claude von Schwartz, what's his name? Karl von Clausewitz. You know, I don't think he can even anticipate an asynchronous war. And to be quite honest, I can't believe that nation states didn't engage asynchronous wars. And I know that in some places that it happened by default, but you know, you've got to sort of translate this into into current and modern times. And I mean, I've only picked this one up completely at random. You know, I did this randomly. I just thought, oh, this guy is, because basically when I picked this up for the first time, one of the first things that I read that impressed me was, and I don't think I'll be able to find it, but I think this is the opening paragraph, which I'll just read on reflection. On Strategy in General is the title of the book, is the title of book 3 of On War. Here, Clausewitz explores the meaning of strategy as well as military genius. He writes that everything in strategy is very simple, but that does not mean that everything is very easy. Clausewitz examines the moral elements of combat: boldness, pervasiveness, and surprise. The very brief chapter, Economy of Force, reveals Clausewitz's rejection of the idea that a theory of war can rest on a body of principles of near universal application. Does not prevent him from including these principles in his own theory. That wasn't what impressed me, but basically, what impressed me was a certain section where he basically talks about how what a lot of in the situations where people are called genius for doing certain things, turning a flank or doing this or doing that, he says, you know, on reflection, it's not, because there's not much you can do. It's very simple. You know, I mean, you in a situation you have the choice to turn a flank or to sort of make a dramatic charge. You know, the decisions are usually quite simple, and then on reflection have, you know, historians forever calling them acts of genius. It's sort of, you know, he's sort of attacking that notion that you know, these people could probably have even possibly considered doing anything else. I mean, there are lots of other things. You know, I mean, you could have people that refuse to move forward, or you know, they're too cautious in battle and things like that. But I think in general, he said, you know, a lot of it is very simple. And you know, when you're moving these things around, you sort of think, well, okay, I mean, it's really not a lot to it. I mean, I've got to go down this road to get to there. You know, and I've done this so many times before in my mind's eye. So, well, hang on, why don't I go this way, down here, and come up this road? Well, yeah, I could, but you know, and that's what you call thinking out of the box. But it doesn't actually change the situation that this is probably the best way to do it. But then you could say, okay, well, I'm going to go this way, and I'm going to attack from this side and this side, etc., etc. And so, you know, I picked this out at random, and the reason I'm sort of mentioning that at this stage is just because there are other works. I mean, in this book I'm reading, it's full of works. I mean, it's got the excerpts from The Art of War, that's Sun Tzu or whatever, on the Genesis, on war, the influence of Clausewitz, the reading relevance on war. So he's got loads of stuff on strategy in general, which is the one I'm reading. It might be that I wanted to write up the Genesis on war. Excerpts from battle studies, G.F.R. Henderson and the American Civil War, Franz Rides Again, the origins of Soviet military doctrine, the Fuller Little Heart lecture, Little Heart, Mao Zedong as a strategist, Mao's protected war theory versus practice, etc., etc. Gorshoff and his navy. Basically, I could be reading things out from where was Mao Zedong. The Art of War. Which is I don't know. I mean, it's got the Art of War. Basically, I could be reading out the Art of War, and that looks quite interesting and exciting, and it's about 20 pages long. So that could, So I think the thing to sort of bear in mind is that there's nothing particular about this. I just wanted to sort of start a series that actually talks about certain. It focuses on some of the more esoteric aspects of war, conflict, and then just look at how that applies. And to be quite honest, I'm not really that sure that anything he really says is that astounding. But he's talked about things, and I think, well, there's some substance there. I mean, if you're talking about the military virtue, I think you could possibly reword it completely to maintain, to sort of, be more along the lines of something like prestige. And say prestige is the virtue of the army based on successful military campaigns in a combination with an armed force that has regularly been pushed to their limits. Full stop. He's really sort of done this, but I think it's more of a sign of the times to some extent. It's 200 years old. And it's part of a much larger body of work. But I think it's still hitting on a few sort of key points. But I'm not sure that how they apply. But I think you've got to sort of think, well, how would they not apply in modern war? And are there lessons that we are not learning or could be learned? And to a larger extent, I don't doubt even for a moment that military thinkers and military leaders have not already got all this down to a T, in their however many years of continued development that they undergo. I mean, Americans, we all know about Sandhurst, Leavenworth, and I don't know wherever they train, but you've got I quite often try to put it into the context of broader things. For example, what about the people of Algeria? How intense is the training of their military leaders in this context? Angola, Anjouan, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Bangladesh, Biafra. You can just go through all these countries. I mean, everything focuses and gravitates, I think, towards the United States because they're one of the biggest. And he says, oh yeah, but you want an alternative. Or how about, the Russians or the Chinese? But what about the Ethiopians? I mean, where does their doctrine come from? And a lot of that probably comes from, external military advisors. They probably find that they're being trained by them. Their army is probably saturated with military consultants from the United States or from Russia or from China. I don't know. But the point is, these lessons are not wholly irrelevant in the context that the people who would have any interest in them and for whom they're relevant already know all of this stuff. The world is actually quite vast, and I think a lot of these people, a lot of these countries probably find that they sort of not as keyed up on some of these very simple things, and it's interesting to sort of reflect in that way. Let me just read. I'm going to read one more paragraph again, just to sort of put it into perspective, just to get back onto track. I don't know which one to read though. Alright, let me just read this one. An army that maintains its cohesion under the most murderous fire, that cannot be shaken by imaginary fears, and resists well-founded ones with all its might, that, proud of its victories, will not lose the strength to obey orders, and its respect and trust for its officers even in defeat, whose physical power, like the muscles of an athlete, have been steeled by training in privation and effort. A force that regards such efforts as a means to victory rather than a curse on its cause, that is mindful in all these duties and qualities by virtue of the single powerful idea of the honour of its arms. Such an army is imbued with the true military spirit. I mean, it's interesting, really, that it says that. It is quite prosaic, but it does sort of give you a clear understanding, I think, as to what he's talking about. Under murderous fire that cannot be shaken by imaginary fears. Imaginary fears. I mean, to be quite honest, that's probably what shook the Iraqis in Mosul in 2014. Will not lose the strength to obey orders. And its respect for trust of its officers, even in defeat. So will not lose its strength to obey orders, even in defeat, or lose its respect for its officers, even in defeat. Whose physical power, like the muscles and athletes, has been steeled by training and privation and effort. A force that can regard such efforts as a means to victory rather than a curse on its cause. You get a lot of this, I think, in the films. You just have to watch an intro for a war film where they're all training around, running around, saying military things and chanting those sort of songs and doing their training and stuff like that, and it always makes me laugh, really, because I don't know. It just I went round an obstacle course once to get in the army, and I started last, and I came first, and I got rejected. And it's sort of being able to withstand all that. It's not the only thing, but I think that there is a sort of a sense that it's saying basically it's not a curse on its cause. The people that would sort of curse military training are really not in that sort of the sort of the virtue that we're talking about here. They look forward to the training because it's really just sort of a means to sort of preparing themselves for the future, etc., etc. I'm going to leave it at that. I sort of read through it, and I haven't really. I don't think I've really sort of done it full justice, but we're nearly at an hour. I mean, we've got 48 minutes, and I'm not sure whether these things are going to be really worth even listening to in the future. But I think that to some extent it's an interesting experiment. I'm going to finish it, but I won't be able to do the next one. The next title is Boldness, and that's 3 pages, and there's still quite a lot to go through. And some of these things I think are going to be more interesting. I think, to be quite honest, I think the last 2 that I've done have been not as really as exciting as they could have been. I mean, Boldness, I think that might be more interesting, a narrative. Perseverance, that sort of interests me. Superiority of numbers, again, I think that's going to be to some extent interesting. Surprise, that's going to be interesting, I think. Cunning, that's the one I've been looking forward to. Concentration of forces in space, unification of forces in time. These are the strategic reserve, economy of force, the geometrical factor. The suspension of action in war, tension and rest, the the character of contemporary warfare, etc. Those are the chapters that we got to come from, and so I think the chapter "Military Virtues of the Army" was probably one of the washiest ones that I could have done. And so, you know, what I would ask you to do is to sort of bear that in mind, that the future ones might have a little more substance or be a bit more interesting. But the only thing I would say is that I did read the whole thing through straight off, and then I only went back to selected parts. I've pretty much broken the text down into, I can remember what each paragraph is sort of a little bit about, but I think there's a couple of paragraphs that I really haven't sort of gone over again. I just read them, and so you might have to listen to it. And I know that you know, I sort of missay things and then start again, so it's not the clearest of narratives. But you know, what I would recommend you do is you listen to what I've said multiple times and take it on board and come up with your own comments on it. Now, I know that no one's going to do that. I mean, my videos get like 6 views, so it's clear that there's not a huge army of people trying to follow, you know, this philosophical or this intellectual exercise. But in theory, you know, that would be the thing to do, and to sort of actually take each paragraph, even to find the text and relate, you know, directly to it, and to actually, you know, interpret it in your own way, and to figure out exactly what it's saying. I don't think I've done that properly, because I just sort of read through, and as I said, there are paragraphs here that I haven't read twice, and I haven't sort of read it twice and then given an interpretation with it. But you know, I mean, it's YouTube, so we don't really have to worry about that. I think I got a comment a while back, and it wasn't about these videos, but it was about one other video, and it's saying, you know, talking about things. Well, there's 2 comments. One talking about dead air, and the other one talking about saying, you know, you should do research first and prepare, and just not like that. You know, I mean, to start off with, everything I do is research. You know, but I think the comment on, you know, preparing things. I just look at other videos on YouTube, and they're sort of like quite obviously highly professional and highly prepared. You know, sort of, oh, perhaps I should have sat down and read the chapter through and made some notes and read it through, so much so that, you know, when I read it, I didn't stall or stammer or stumble on words, and had something interesting to say, you know, etc., etc. But you know, I'm just not like that. You know, I just sort of, I haven't, you know, this next section is going to be on boldness. I've not read it. The only time I'll read it is when when I do the video, but that won't be for a few months now. So, you know, I understand that the videos and the whole, everything I've got here is not sort of, you know, you get these sort of videos and they've got this sort of introduction and they've got music, and the thing that really bugs me is when they sound so cheerful all the time, you know, like they're shouting and loud, and the only thing I do sort of think that I could or should or would like to improve on is the overall narrative style. And some people are, you know, used to thinking, you sit there and think, this person has, you know, a really good method, and I don't want to call it voice acting, but I mean, I would say I'm more natural in the sense I'm just talking naturally, and so, you know, sometimes I'm looking at the microphone, sometimes I'm not. I don't even have a good setup for all of that. But I think, you know, I know that I've in a number of sort of times that I've watched and listened to what I've done in the past, just like I've done there, I stalled. You know, I'm not really saying anything. I'm mumbling and yeah, well, you know, and I think what I'm really big on is and you know, and sort of you realise that a lot of other people are just not doing that, and they're getting to the point and they're not self-reflecting, and it's highly more professional, so to speak. But you know, I'm just sort of really just trying to put it into perspective that this is not sort of an academic study on this work. It's just me sitting here reading it and coming up with whatever comes off the top of my head. Quite often, and it was the case in the other one, the previous chapter, I had some pretty good ideas a couple of hours after I did the video, but it's too late, I'd done it. And, and I was thinking, well, those are really good ideas, and they're completely just lost. Can't even remember what they were now. So anyway, I'm going to leave it at that, because it really is just trotting along. I'll add this, and I will get on to boldness next, so stay tuned.